We're privileged to have Gordon S. Wood with us for this 2019 James Madison Lecture. Professor Wood is, I think it's fair to say, the Dean of Early American Historians. He's the Alva Professor Emeritus at Brown University. Born in Concord, Massachusetts, where the Revolutionary War began, he was raised in that Commonwealth and graduated summa cum laude from Tufts University. He then earned an MA and PhD from Harvard University, where he studied under Bernard Bailyn. He taught at Harvard and the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969. A prolific author, Professor Wood has won numerous awards. In 1970, his book, The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, won the Bancroft Prize. And in 1993, his Radicalism of the American Revolution won the Pulitzer Prize for History. The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin was awarded the Julia Ward Howe Prize by the Boston Authors Club in 2005. His volume in the Oxford History of the United States, entitled Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, was given the Association of American Publishers Award for History and Biography in 2009. The American History Book Prize by the New York Historical Society, and the Society of the Cincinnati History Prize in 2010. And incidentally, Professor Wood, we heard from your former student, Jack Warren, the executive director of the society last week. That same year, 2010, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, the country's oldest learned society. He and his wife, Louise, have 3 children, 2 of whom are professors and all of whom are involved in education. So I know he'll find a receptive audience here. Please join me in giving a warm Madison Foundation welcome to Professor Gordon Wood.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that very generous introduction. Well, I'm delighted to be here to talk to so many teachers. My wife was a teacher, English teacher, and I always thought that she did much more to further education than I ever did. You know, professors profess, teachers have to teach, and there's a big difference. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, on a platform of promoting preventing the extension of slavery into the West, the southern states felt their way of life was threatened, and they seceded from the Union. Since many states, including those of New England, had talked of seceding from the Union at various times in the antebellum period, explaining the secession of the southern states is not, it seems to me, a major historical problem. We can fairly easily account, I think, for why the southern states seceded. What is more difficult to explain is why the northern states cared. Why was the North willing to go to war to preserve the Union? It was not because the North was bent on the abolition of slavery, at least not at first. Many Northerners, of course, were opposed to slavery, but what they were really especially opposed to was the extension of slavery into the West. Northerners were opposed to the extension of slavery into the West because they knew that slavery would create a society incompatible with the one they wanted for their children and grandchildren, who they presumed would settle in the West. But this was not the only reason why the North cared enough for the Union to engage in a long and bloody war that most Northerners gave up several 100,000 lives for. To fully understand why the North cared enough to resist the secession of the southern states, we have to go back to the Revolution and the ideas and the ideals that came out of it. Lincoln's words, which have been aptly called his sword, were crucial in sustaining the struggle to maintain the Union. With his words, he reached back to the Revolution to draw inspiration and understanding of what the Civil War meant for the nation and the world. He knew what the Revolution was about and what it implied, not just for Americans, but for all humanity. The United States, he said, was a new republican nation in a world of monarchies, a grand experiment in self-government, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. The American people of 1860, said Lincoln, deeply felt this moral principle of equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and this moral principle made them one with the founders. In Lincoln's word, in an incredible image, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. This emphasis on liberty and equality, he said, was the electric, he shifts metaphors here, was the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men everywhere, that will link these patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. Now, with words like these, drawing on the meaning of the American Revolution, Lincoln expressed what many Americans felt about themselves and the future of all mankind. Liberty and equality, he said, were prominent, not just for the people of this nation, but to the world, for all future time. The Revolution, he said, gave promise that in due time the weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance in the race of life. But if the American experiment in self-government failed, then this hope for the future would be lost. Spreading freedom and democracy around the world had been an explicit goal of the Revolution. It's what turned the Americans' little colonial rebellion into a world historical event, important for everyone throughout the world. Americans believed that the French Revolution of 1789 was a direct consequence of their revolution. And Lafayette thought so too, which is why he sent the key to the Bastille, that symbol of the Ancien regime. He sent that key to George Washington, and it hangs today in Mount Vernon. But all the 19th century efforts in creating democracy in Europe had ended in failure. Americans had seen the French Revolution spiral into tyranny, and all attempts of Europeans to create democracies in the revolutions of 1848 had been crushed. By the 1860s, as Lincoln pointed out, the United States was a lone beacon of democratic freedom in a world of monarchies. On American shoulders alone, rested the survival of the possibility of self-government. It was indeed the last best hope for the future of democracy. That responsibility was what sustained Lincoln throughout the war. A war, as he said in his Gettysburg Address, that was testing whether this nation, dedicated to liberty, equality, and self-government, could long endure. Whenever we commemorate the Civil War, we commemorate the Revolution. Indeed, in an important sense, Northern success in the Civil War was the culmination of the Revolution. Now, how did this nation that had been so divided, or at least divided enough to defeat the greatest power in the world, fall apart and engage in a long and bloody civil war? The seeds of the Civil War were probably sown when the first African slaves were brought to Virginia in 1619. But no one sensed then that that consequence was likely. Even in 1776, when Americans declared their independence from Great Britain, no one foresaw a war in this newly created United States. To be sure, the 13 separate North American colonies were not very united. That they were able to come together at all in 1776 was something of a miracle. Before the Revolution, the British colonies had little sense of connectedness with one another. Most of them had closer ties with London and Britain than they had with one another. Until the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774, more of its members had been to London than had been to Philadelphia. It was Great Britain and its policies that created the colonists' sense of being Americans. In fact, the British officials were the ones who first defined the colonists as Americans. Right. Until the last moment before independence, the colonists thought of themselves as Englishmen. It was British tyranny expressed in the coercive acts of 1774 that made the colonists like Patrick Henry declare that they were not Virginians or New Englanders or New Yorkers, but Americans. The long and bloody war with Great Britain, in which all parts of the country suffered at one time or another, was a searing experience. More Americans died in that war in proportion to population than in any other war in our history, except, of course, for the Civil War, where both sides were Americans. No wonder that the Revolution bred an overwhelming sense of unity. The glorious cause of the Revolution united all Americans. The Revolution and the beliefs and ideals that came out of it, liberty, equality, self-government, created national bonds that were not easily broken. Indeed, they are the bonds that still hold us together and make us think of ourselves as a single people. Of course, Americans at the time of the Revolution were aware of sectional differences, differences that were essentially based on slavery. Although slavery in 1776 legally existed in all the new Republican states, 90% of the nearly 500,000 African-American slaves, constituting about a fifth of the total population of the country, that fifth lived in the South, working in the tobacco fields of Chesapeake or in the rice swamps of South Carolina and Georgia. These southern states were obviously different from those in the North. In 1776, John Adams worried that the South was too aristocratic for the kind of popular Republican government he advocated in his pamphlet, Thoughts on Government. But he was surprised to learn that the southern states did more or less adopt the kind of popular mixed government he had suggested. And he expressed relief in seeing the pride of the haughty brought down a little by the Revolution. Of course, what Adams was referring to was a slaveholding society dominated by planter aristocrats that contrasted with the more egalitarian, small farm societies of the North, especially in the states of New England. But slavery was not inconsequential in the North. As you perhaps know, black slaves made up nearly 7% of the population of New Jersey and 14% of the population of New York City. Nearly 12% of Rhode Island's population was composed of slaves. It was not just the Southern revolutionary leaders, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and so on, who owned slaves. So did many of the Northern leaders, Boston's John Hancock, New York's Robert Livingston, and Philadelphia's John Dickinson. They were all slaveholders. On the eve of the Revolution, the mayor of Philadelphia possessed 31 slaves. Nonetheless, the sectional differences were obvious. In the mid-1780s, the Boston merchant Stephen Higginson was convinced that in their beliefs, habits, manners, and commercial interests, the southern and northern states were not only very dissimilar, but in many instances directly opposed to one another. Jefferson, I think, agreed. And in 1785, he outlined to a French friend his sense of the differences between the people of the two sections, the two societies, which he attributed mostly to differences of climate. The Northerners were cool, sober, laborious, persevering, independent, jealous of their own liberties, and just to those of others, interested, chicaning, superstitious, and hypocritical in their religion. By contrast, said Jefferson, the Southerners were fiery, voluptuary, indolent, unsteady, independent, zealous for for their liberties, but trampling upon those of others, generous, candid, and without attachment or pretensions to any religion but that of the heart. Despite his sensitivity to the differences, however, Jefferson and most other Southern planners did not as yet see these sectional differences as endangering national unity. Now, since we know how the story turned out, it's easy to read back signs of what we know will happen. But it's a mistake to, I think, see too many anticipations of the Civil War and the Revolutionary decades. In the 1780s, leaders from both the South and the North came to realize that the Confederation, the League of States, created in 1777 and ratified in 1781, was not working out and would have to be reformed or scrapped altogether. The slaveholding state of Virginia took the lead in this reform and was supported by national-minded leaders from the northern states. The differences that arose in the Constitutional Convention and later in the 1790s were differences, I think, essentially of ideology, not sectional differences. The delegates differed essentially over the strength of the national government vis-à-vis the states. The split in the convention, the Constitutional Convention, was essentially between the large states that wanted proportional representation in both houses of Congress and the small states that feared being overwhelmed by the more populous states. James Madison of Virginia and James Wilson of Pennsylvania eventually had to surrender to the wishes of the small states and accept the so-called Connecticut Compromise that gave equal representation of 2 senators from each state. The issue, in other words, did not divide along sectional lines, although at one point Madison tried to suggest that the real division in the convention was between the slaveholding and the non-slaveholding states. Everyone knew that this was a tactical feint designed by Madison to get the convention off the large and small state division in favor of proportional representation to both houses. So fearful was he of the power of the state legislatures to vitiate national authority that each state legislature electing 2 senators that he regarded the Connecticut Compromise not as a compromise, but as a major defeat. Now, the party division that arose in the 1790s was not essentially, I think, between North and South. The difference between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans was over the nature of the national government and support for the French Revolution. Although the leadership and base of the Republican Party was certainly located in the South, the party was not and could not be exclusively a sectional party. The Northern Republicans were a very important and increasingly dynamic part of the party. Jefferson rightly never saw himself as the leader of a sectional party. He was, as he said, the leader of the world's best hope, a popular democratic Republican government that was something new under the sun and that promised essentially to eventually ameliorate the conditions of mankind over a great portion of the globe. No wonder Lincoln paid all honor to Jefferson. His vision was essentially Jefferson's vision. Still, there was the serpent of slavery, lurking in this Arcadian garden of yeoman farmers that threatened to destroy the democratic Republican dream. At the outset, the revolutionary leaders were well aware of this serpent. They knew from the beginning that slavery was incompatible with the ideals of the Revolution. Indeed, it was the Revolution that made slavery a problem for Americans. Before the mid-18th century, most Americans, like the rest of the world for thousands of years, largely took slavery for granted as the lowest and most degraded status in a hierarchical world of degrees of unfreedom and dependency. And for the colonists, and few colonists had bothered to criticize the institution of slavery. But the Revolution changed everything. All the revolutionary leaders realized at once that there was something painfully inconsistent between their talk of freedom for themselves and the owning of black slaves. If all men were created equal, as all enlightened persons were now saying, then what justification could there be for holding Africans in slavery? Since the American colonists are, by the law of nature, born free, as indeed all men are, white or black, does it follow, asked James Otis of Massachusetts in 1764, does it follow that it is right to enslave a man because he is black? The revolutionary rhetoric made the contradiction excruciating for many Americans, both in the North and even in the South. Prominent slaveholding Southerners, like Jefferson, declared that the abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in these colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. Given the mounting sense of inconsistency between the revolutionary ideals and the holding of people in bondage, it's not surprising that the first anti-slave convention in the history of the world was held in Philadelphia in 1775. Now, if the revolutionary leaders, those founders who were otherwise so enlightened and so far-sighted, knew that slavery contradicted everything the revolution was about, why didn't they do more to end the institution that they claimed to abhor? I think this is the question many historians and many people in the society are asking today. The reason I think that they didn't act more forcefully was that many of them, perhaps most, thought that time was on the side of abolition. As incredible as it may seem to us, who know what they could not know, that is their future, the leaders tended to believe that slavery was on its last legs and was headed for eventual destruction. Dr. Benjamin Rush was convinced that the desire to abolish the institution prevails in our council and among all ranks in every province, with hostility towards slavery mounting everywhere among the enlightened in the Atlantic world. Rush in 1774 predicted that there will not be a Negro slave in North America in 40 years. Enlightened Virginians also assumed that slavery could not long endure. Jefferson told a French correspondent in 1786 that there were in the Virginia legislature men of virtue and talents enough to propose and to move toward the gradual emancipation of slaves. To be sure, they saw that the moment of emancipation had not yet arrived, but, said Jefferson, with the spread of light and liberality among the slaveholders, that moment was coming. Slavery simply could not stand against the relentless march of liberty and progress. That the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 was scrupulous in not mentioning slaves, slavery, or Negroes in the final draft of the Constitution seemed to point toward a future without the shameful institution. If the revolutionary dream that slavery would naturally die away had been realized, there would, of course, never have been a civil war. This illusion that slavery would die a natural death led the revolutionary leaders to table efforts to abolish the institution. They thought that in time it would simply wither away. But slavery in the United States was not at all on its last legs. Predictions of its demise could not have been more wrong. Far from being doomed, American slavery, in fact, was on the verge of its greatest expansion. Now, how could the revolutionary leaders have been so mistaken? How could they have deceived themselves so completely? For a full generation, the nation's leaders lived with the illusion that the institution of slavery was declining and on its way to being eliminated. Of all the illusions they had about the future, this, I think, was the greatest. But the founders' self-deception and mistaken optimism was understandable, for they wanted to believe the best, and initially there was evidence that slavery was in fact being eliminated and dying out. The northern states, where slavery was not deeply rooted, as we know, in the economy, began immediately to attack the institution with the revolution. And by 1804, every northern state had provided for the eventual end of slavery. The South, where slavery, of course, was much more deeply entrenched in the economy and the society, was slower to act. But even in the South, there were encouraging signs of movement against the institution, especially in Virginia. Virginia was no ordinary state. It was by far the most populous state. Indeed, by itself, it made up a fifth of the population of the entire nation. It was as well the largest state in territory and the richest state. It's not surprising that 4 out of the first 5 presidents were Virginians, and that the working model for the Constitution in the Convention was the Virginia Plan. During the first few decades of the new republic, Virginia dominated the nation as no state ever has. As Virginia went, so went the nation. Now, there were signs in the 1780s and 1790s that Virginia was trying to do something about slavery. If Virginia could abolish slavery, then it was assumed then the rest of the South would surely follow. In Virginia, the harsh black codes of the early 18th century had fallen into neglect. And by the time of the Revolution, fraternization between whites and black slaves had become more common, both in sporting events and in religion. The growing of wheat instead of tobacco was changing the nature of slavery in the Upper South, and many of the planters, now calling themselves farmers, began hiring out their slaves, suggesting to some that slavery might eventually be replaced by wage labor. Other evidence from the Upper South seemed to reinforce the idea that slavery was on its way to extinction. What could be a more conspicuous endorsement? And this is incredible when you think about it. A more conspicuous endorsement of the anti-slave cause than having the College of William and Mary, a board of visitors made up of wealthy slaveholding planters, in 1791 confer an honorary degree on the celebrated British abolitionist Granville Sharp. Think about that. That there were more anti-slave societies created in the South than in the North was bound to make people feel that the South was moving in the same direction of gradual emancipation as the North. In Virginia and Maryland, some of these anti-slave societies brought freedom suits in the state courts that led to some piecemeal emancipation. These suits may not seem very meaningful by our standards, but by the standards of the 18th century, they were significant. If the slaves could demonstrate that they had a maternal Indian or white ancestor, they could be immediately freed. And hearsay evidence was often enough to convince the courts. Whole families, recalled one sympathetic observer, were often liberated by a single verdict, the fate of one relative deciding the fate of many. By 1796, nearly 30 freedom suits were pending in Virginia courts. By the 1790s, the free black population in the Upper South had increased to over 30,000. And by 1810, the free blacks in this area numbered over 94,000 people. When even Southerners like Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Henry Lawrence, and St. George Tucker publicly deplored the institution, the injustice of slavery, from that moment declared the New York physician and abolitionist E.H. Smith in 1798, from that moment the slow but certain death wound was inflicted upon it. Everywhere, even in South Carolina, slaveholders began to feel defensive about slavery and began to sense a public pressure against the institution that they had never felt before. In the aftermath of the Revolution, whites in Charleston, South Carolina, expressed squeamishness about the evils of slavery, especially the public trading and punishment of slaves. In the 1780s, some of the Carolina masters expressed a growing reluctance to break up families and even began manumitting their slaves, freeing more slaves in that decade of the 1780s than had been freed in the previous 3 decades. What helped to convince many people in the North that slavery's days were numbered was the promised ending of the despicable slave trade in 1808. Almost everywhere in the New World, slavery was dependent on the continued importation of slaves from Africa. Although this need for slaves from Africa was no longer true of the Upper South, South Carolina and Georgia were still importing slaves. The fact that the Deep South and the rest of the New World, Latin America and the Caribbean, needed slave importations to maintain the institution deluded many Americans into believing that slavery in America was also dependent on the international slave trade, and that ending the slave trade would eventually end slavery itself. Those who held out that hope were utterly wrong, of course. They simply did not appreciate how demographically different North American slavery was from that in South America and in the Caribbean. They were blind to the fact that in most states of North America, the slaves were approximating the growth of whites, nearly doubling in number every 20 to 25 years, which of course was twice as fast as the Europeans were growing. Northerners had little and no appreciation that slavery in the South was a healthy, vigorous, and expansive institution. As far as they were concerned, the Virginia and Maryland planters, who had more slaves than they knew what to do with, were enthusiastically supporting an end to an international slave trade as the first major step in eliminating the institution of slavery itself. This assault on the overseas slave trade appeared to align the Chesapeake planters with the anti-slave forces in the North and confused many Northerners about the real intentions of the Upper South, which in fact was in the business of exporting its surplus of slaves to the Lower South. Now, all these developments misled many Americans and allowed them to postpone dealing with the issue. Like John Adams and Oliver Ellsworth, the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they thought that that once the importation of slaves was cut off, white laborers would become so numerous that the need for slaves would disappear. Slavery, said Ellsworth, in time will not be a speck in our country. Now, in the meantime, the initial differences between the two sections were rapidly and dramatically increasing, becoming more severe. During the 3 or 4 decades following the Revolution, the North and South grew much further apart. Both sections were American and Republican. Both professed a similar rhetoric of liberty and popular government, but beneath the surface, they were fast becoming very different places with different cultures, different values, one coming to honor common labor as the supreme human activity, the other continuing to think of labor, manual labor, in traditional terms as mean and despicable and fit only for slaves. When, on the eve of the Civil War, the South complained that it had remained true to the 18th century republic and that it was the North that had changed, it was absolutely right, correct. In the years immediately following the Revolution, the North was radically transformed, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. It was not just that the population growth in the two sections was different, although by 1810 New York had surpassed Virginia as the largest state. It was the varied nature of the growth in the North. The northern states were building turnpikes and canals, creating banks and corporations, and greasing the growing internal trade with paper money to an extent not duplicated in the southern states. Everywhere in the northern states, farm families were busy buying and selling with each other. The society was still predominantly rural, still agricultural, but with no large manufacturing cities as in England, but in many respects, but many northern towns, people seemed to be doing nothing else but doing everything else but farming. By 1815, even the little tiny town of Mount Pleasant, Ohio, with a population of only 500 persons, had several dozen artisans and manufacturing shops, including 3 saddlers, 3 hatters, 4 blacksmiths, 4 weavers, 6 shoemakers, 3 cabinet makers, 1 baker, 1 apothecary, 2 wagon makers, 2 tanneries, 1 wool carding machine maker, 1 wool carding machinist, one wool spinning machinist, one fleece spinner, one flax spinner, and one nail factory. Within a 6-mile radius of this little town, 500 people, there were 9 merchant mills, 2 grist mills, 12 sawmills, and 1 paper mill, 1 woolen factory, and 2 fulling mills. Now, there's nothing like that in the South. Nothing like this little Ohio town in the South. The North was becoming the most highly commercialized society in the world. The North was becoming increasingly dominated by hosts of middling people, what we will later call middle-class people, commercial farmers, mechanics, clerks, teachers, businessmen, industrious, self-trained, would-be professionals who celebrated work and the making of money to a degree unprecedented in the Atlantic world. This celebration of labor, especially manual labor, was important. Ever since Aristotle, leisured aristocrats and the professional classes had held labor, especially manual labor and the making of money, in contempt. Even someone who ran a business, say a printing business with 20 employees, was nonetheless considered to be involved with manual labor and thus contemptible. Such men who worked for a living, Aristotle said, could never possess virtue and could never exercise political leadership. Perhaps nothing came to separate the North and the South more than their contrasting views of labor. The South, dominated as it was by leisured slaveholding planters, could scarcely conceive of labor as anything but despicable and shameful. Slavery, as it had for centuries, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, required a culture that held labor in contempt. Scorn for work and the holding of slaves were 2 sides of the same coin. The North developed very differently. In the several decades following the Revolution, the middling men of the North, using egalitarian rhetoric of the Revolution, launched a wholesale campaign against aristocrats who had scorned them for ages. They urged each other to shed their earlier political apathy and to rouse against all those gentlemen who, as one critic said, were not under the necessity of gaining their bread by industry, called them parasites, living off the labor of honest farmers and mechanics. These leisured aristocrats who do not labor, but who enjoy in luxury the fruits of labor, these northern critics said, had no right to decide the laws as they had in the past. Of course, the American aristocrats these middling people attacked were not European aristocrats. In the eyes of these middling sorts, these leisured aristocrats were more what we might call elites. The 1% perhaps, or the elites. And they were the deplorables in the eyes of these elites. And they were mostly members of the professions: lawyers, judges, physicians, clergymen, government officials, professors. These are the elites that were assaulted by the middling sorts of people. Anyone who was not involved with manual labor in one form or another. In the eyes of these middling sorts, artisans, clerks, businessmen, these elites seemed to do no real work. This celebration of labor inevitably made the South, with its leisured, aristocratic leadership supported by slavery, seem increasingly anomalous. In reaction, the Southern aristocrats began emphasizing their cavalier status in contrast to the money-grubbing Northern Yankees. They began claiming that they were the only true gentlemen left in America. Now, it was not just the brutal fact of slavery that mattered, it was what slavery did to the society. Slavery in the South tended to create a different society, a different economy, a different culture from the North. While the North was coming to value labor as necessary and fit for all social ranks, much of the white population of the South was becoming more and more contemptuous of work and more desirous of acquiring the leisure that slavery seemed to afford. Indeed, so great was the white cult of indolence that some Southerners began to worry about discrepancy between the industrious North and the lethargic, lazy South. Where there is Negro slavery, one concerned Virginian told James Madison, there will be laziness, carelessness, and wastefulness. Not so much among the slaves, he said, as among the white masters. The South grew in population and prospered, but its culture and its society remained traditional in many ways. During the antebellum decades, when the North was commercially exploding, the South remained essentially what it had been in the 18th century, a staple-producing slaveholding society. Cotton replaced tobacco and rice as the principal staple. But the society, the economy, and much of the politics remains roughly what it had been during the 18th century. Slavery determined the organization of the society. The wealthy slaveholding planters dominated their society to a degree no group in the North could match. They managed the overseas marketing of the staple crop for the small planters, which reinforced the unequal relationship between patrons and clients. More important, their patriarchal system of slavery sustained a hierarchical society, a society that was very different from that of the northern states. The commercial institutions that were springing up in the North had few counterparts in the southern states. The South did not have the numbers of turnpikes, canals, banks, corporations, and issues of paper money that the North had. Fearing any interference with their peculiar institution, the planter-dominated legislatures kept government to a minimum. They taxed their citizens much less heavily than the Northerners and spent much less on education and social services than did the Northern legislatures. Although most Southern farmers were not slaveholders, and many of the plain folk of the South surely worked as hard as any ambitious Northern artisan, these ordinary Southern folk could never give the same kind of enterprising, middling tone to Southern society that existed in the North. There were fewer middling institutions in the South, fewer towns, fewer schools, fewer newspapers, fewer businesses, fewer manufacturing firms, and fewer shops. And there were fewer middling people in the South, fewer teachers, fewer clerks, fewer publishers, fewer editors, fewer engineers, fewer inventors, and fewer patents. The antebellum South never became a middling, commercial-minded society like that of the North. Its patriarchal order of large slaveholders continued to dominate both the culture and the politics of the section. As James Madison privately admitted in the 1790s, in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. Now, as the North and South gradually grew apart, each section began expressing increasing frustration with the other, aggravating differences that had been present from the beginning of the Revolution. Northerners, especially New England Federalists, began to complain about what they now saw as the unjustified Southern domination of the federal government. They focused on the 3/5 clause of the Constitution that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for assessing representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. The Federalists charged that the 3/5 clause gave an unfair advantage to the Republicans and was responsible for Jefferson's election in 1800. Thus was born the idea of the slave power that was unfairly usurping control of the national government from the free states. Even more unsettling to some Northerners was the gradual realization that slavery was not dying in the South after all. The earlier enthusiasm of the Upper South for liberalism in its slave system began to dissipate, especially following the news of the rebellion in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which of course became Haiti. Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia in 1800 further destroyed the hopes of many that Virginia was gradually eliminating slavery. The earlier leniency in judging freedom suits in Virginia ended, and manumissions in the state rapidly declined. Southerners now began reversing their earlier examples of racial mingling. The evangelical Protestant churches ended their practice of mixed congregations. After 1800, the southern states began enacting new sets of black codes. that resembled later Jim Crow laws, tightening up the institution of slavery and restricting the behavior of free blacks. Indeed, because free blacks seemed to threaten the slave system right at its heart, they were compelled by law now to leave the southern states. Now, the final blow to all the illusions the founders had lived with came with the Missouri Crisis of 1819. The attempt by the New York Congressman James Talmadge Jr. in the House of Representatives to attach a prohibition of slavery to the bill admitting Missouri to the Union precipitated a sectional crisis more severe than anything felt before. Jefferson told John Adams, "From the Battle of Bunker's Hill to the Treaty of Paris, we never had so ominous a question. I thank God that I shall not live to witness its issue." The Missouri crisis caused the scales to fall from the eyes of both Northerners and Southerners. The North came to realize clearly that the South was not going to abolish slavery, that it was aiming to carry the institution into the West. The South, for its part, came to realize more clearly than ever before that the North really cared about abolishing slavery and would never, never stop trying to end it, and certainly did not, and they did not want, and those Northerners did not want the institution to spread to the West. From that moment, Americans clearly saw signs of a storm on the horizon. At first, no bigger than a man's hand, but signs of a storm that would grow larger and more ominous every year. From that moment, I believe, the Civil War became inevitable. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.
Questions? Okay. We have roving microphones, so quick those microphones. Go ahead.
Sure.
In speaking of the growth of slavery and the conflicts that were happening at that time, today we're mired in big conflicts over our heritage. How would you advise governments, state governments, cities, et cetera, to deal with their statues, plaques, the legacy of what you've described so eloquently?
Well, I'm a historian. I believe that the past is part of our culture. I'm very uneasy about these efforts to remove statues and so on. It's not different from what the Taliban was doing in the Middle East, and we condemn that because they had religious objections to the temples that were there. I think these things need to be explained, but they're part of our past, and we must confront that past. But we don't have to remain wedded to that past. And I understand the objections that, say, young black students would have to a statue of a Confederate general that was who was a slaveholder and led the Confederacy, one of the leaders of the Confederacy. But somehow that has to be explained. Now, maybe the statues have to be removed, at least temporarily, to museums and maintained there and contextualized, that is, explained and so on. But I think it's a very dangerous thing to start erasing one's past. That's what the Soviets did. That's what ideologues do when they come into power, and we don't want to be that kind of people, I don't think. I think we know our history is mixed bag, of course, but I think there are other elements in it that redeem us, I hope. I know what's being taught in the universities now, the tale of American history is a tale of oppression and woe. I think that's unfortunate. There are facts that are being emphasized, the feats of Indians, the extent of slaveholding. At the same time, there are other facts that also need to be emphasized. So we need a balanced picture, at least, of our past. Otherwise, I think we leave ourselves unequipped to deal with the world. We're not a terrible nation, and we need to have some balanced view of our past. But it is a very, as you know, a very complicated issue and very tricky and difficult. And I don't have any easy answers for this dilemma that we all face. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a high school teacher. Probably don't need the microphone, but I'll use it. Thank you so much. Your lecture was very informative. I had two questions. I'll present one. I've taught that Eli Whitney's invention was probably as powerful as the cultural standards in the South, because it was the mechanism, the tool that allowed for the importation of more slaves. And also the Mexican-American War and the new territories. And would you give them equal weight?
Well, I think that Whitney got credit for the invention. He was an engineer, but somebody was going to invent. There was a lot of money to be made if you could come up with a machine that did what that did, and that was in the cards. It was going to happen that year or next year. Somebody else was going to do it. So he happens to get all the credit or blame for that. But that device was going to be invented by somebody. Now the Mexican War, we were maybe we were and maybe we still are, but we were a very expansionist nation. But it was demographic imperialism, if you will. We had people moving at tremendous rates, and we took a huge chunk of territory from Mexico. Most with some Mexican citizens, but not a huge numbers, not going into a fully inhabited. We weren't taking fully inhabited land, but we wanted that territory, and there's no doubt that was. And of course, it may be in the future, as a number of Mexican immigrants come to the United States, that they might say, well, we'd like to get that back. I think if the immigrants become Americanized, they probably say, well, we're not going to go back to joining Mexico. But there's a major part of our country, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California, all belong to Mexico. And we took it in a war. But wars have consequences, and that's the same would be true of the Indians. We fought almost a century, well, more than a century, against the Indians, and essentially destroyed them. But wars have consequences, and we've seen that. The Germans have lost huge amounts of territory as a consequence of World War II, and they were moved. People were moved. Hundreds of thousands of people were moved after World War II. I don't hear a lot of complaints. Maybe some German citizens 100 years from now will say, we used to have Königsberg. That's where Kant was born. Why don't we get it back? That kind of thing has gone on for the history of the world. So we were involved in certain major changes, demographic changes, and geographic changes that are part of history. For good or for ill, it was part of the dynamic character of this nation. Yes, sir. Oh, and now I'll come back to you.
Hi, thank you for being here today. My question is, and this is obviously a counterfactual, but looking back, is there are there steps that could have been taken that might have alleviated the concerns of Southern slaveholders and alleviated the concerns of Northerners that might have staved off or prevented the Civil War from happening, in your opinion?
I don't think so. I think this institution was too deeply entrenched in the Southern economy and society. The numbers were too great. 40% of this state, Virginia, or the state of Virginia, this is not, you're in the district, but in the state of Virginia was made up of black slaves. 60% of South Carolina, was the proportion. Those proportions are so high, it's difficult for me to see how the problem could have been solved. They weren't, the best minds were concentrated, as I mentioned, they thought things were going the right way, but they really didn't know the reality. They live with illusions. Of course, we live with illusions too, we just don't know what they are. Historians will look back and say, well, how could they be thinking that? You have to understand that we don't know our future. They didn't know their future any more than we know ours. We have all kinds of predictions about what will be, and we're in better shape to make those predictions, but we really can't be sure what it's going to be like at the end of the 21st century. And they did the best they could, I think, given the circumstances. Now, it looks easy when you look back and say, well, why couldn't they have done that? Why? This just wasn't going to happen. I don't think there was anything that could have been done to solve the problem. Once you got going like this, as I say, by the time you get to the Missouri crisis, that's it. The war is inevitable as far as I'm concerned. There's just no way to stop the sections from clashing. Now, all those compromises were just postponing the inevitable. And the war came, as Lincoln said. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. This way, yeah.
I found it super interesting that you say that the moment of no return is the Missouri Compromise, and I hadn't thought about that before. And so what I was thinking about was the Northwest Territory and how we go from the Northwest Ordinance, which that outlaws slavery, very, very early, and it's confirmed over and over again as these states join the Union. How do we go from a Northwest Territory, which puts a value on no slavery and on public education, to a Missouri Compromise in basically a generation? Well,
of course, the Northwest, as David McCullough's new book points out, is settled essentially by New Englanders. They were really sending hordes of people out west. The New England economy was unable to sustain its rapidly growing population. So sons and daughters left by the hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands. And so the Northwest, if slavery, if it had been settled by Southerners, and in some parts, Indiana was a very, very divided state, and Illinois too, they had fights in the state. And it's a demographic fight, and if you had more slaveholders, the state might have gone slave. But fortunately, I think for both of those states, the northern anti-slave people had the numbers. But there were slaveholders, and slavery was existing despite the Northwest Ordinance there. But the states, when the territories became states, they just took action and forced the slaveholders either to give them up or to move out. But demography and the movement of people are more determinative of events than any laws. Think about the Constitution that prohibits the states from printing paper money. If that had been enforced, that was the principal reason why the convention was held. Madison and the other leaders hated paper money. But paper money was the source of the commercial dynamism of the North, and they needed that paper money. And of course, what they did was the states got around that prohibition by chartering banks, which then issued the paper money. So forces will find a way around the technical or legal documentary prohibitions. And the people who were slaveholders simply didn't go into tried to stay away from the Northwest and went into the Southwest. So I think it was settled mostly by New Englanders. Yes. Go ahead. I think it's second row there. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hello. I had a question about your interpretation of the revolutionary founders and their ideology regarding slavery. So you said that they believed that it was on its way out, and that's why they did not take stronger steps to abolish it. And I was thinking about connections to Abraham Lincoln and how Lincoln many times made unpopular choices under the idea of compromising. You know, Frederick Douglass would have liked Lincoln to be a little bit more forceful after the war, but he wasn't. Do you think perhaps it could be the fact that they had so many different things to think about and they were willing to compromise with the southern states, for example, in order to get the Constitution ratified, or do they, and similar to Lincoln, being willing to compromise?
Well, sure. Lincoln was a politician, but of a very high order when you think about it. I mean, he was a Democratic politician, small d. I mean, and so he had to deal with realities, but he, unlike many of our present-day politicians, he transcended that reality, and so many in his rhetoric and his language was so extraordinary. But he was a man of prudence, which is the principal, I think, principal quality needed by politicians. And he was willing to compromise. You know, he said on this eve of the Civil War, look, I'm not out to destroy slavery in the existing states. I and the Republican Party will guarantee the existence of slavery in the existing states. It's the West that we won't guarantee, and that became the crucial issue. Of course, Lincoln felt that if slavery couldn't expand, that it would die. So by taking that stand, he hoped that that would be, but he was willing to compromise and actually support an amendment to the Constitution that would preserve slavery in the existing states. So, yeah, ability to compromise is important if you're going to get along with your opponents and have anything get done. And it's one of the problems we're having, as you know. And if you get if your partisanship gets overwhelming and compromise becomes impossible, then you have great difficulties, as we know. But what lay behind their willingness to compromise, certainly in the Constitutional Convention, was the sense that slavery would die away. If they didn't have that, I think they might have taken a stronger stand. The Virginians were ready, you see, in 1787 to make a lot of concessions to Northern opinion. It's South Carolina and Georgia that are really resisting, would have walked out. If there'd been, Gouverneur Morris was an irritant. He was a New Yorker who kept pushing, well, let's abolish slavery. And the Georgians and the South Carolinians said they would walk out of the convention. Well, that would have really affected the Union. It would have collapsed. So there were people willing to compromise on that issue. Now, in retrospect, it looks like, oh, why did they do that? But I think at that point they thought union was more important than slavery, because slavery is on its way out anyhow. Now, if you don't believe that, and of course that's not the reality, but that's what they lived with, this illusion that it was dying. And they sincerely believed. You can find an enormous number of statements of that sort in the literature. Now, they were all wrong, but you know, we don't know what our illusions are, as I say. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. You began your lecture by saying that it was unsurprising that the South would secede because secession was a common thing, and then you said that the Civil War was inevitable after the compromise. So what is the factor that leads Lincoln not to compromise? He compromises later, but ultimately he fights to preserve the Union.
Oh, I think it's this vision. You see, Lincoln is talking in the aftermath of the failure of the revolutions of 1848. Now, we can't appreciate those revolutions, but the whole of Europe was monarchical. And all of a sudden you have a whole series of rebellions in every country except England, which has its own smaller little disturbances, but democracy is racing through in Germany and France and Italy, Switzerland. I mean, they're all having the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. They're having upheavals, and it's much more pervasive than, say, that we got so excited about the Arab Spring. Well, this was a European Spring, and it was really, really exciting for many people in America. And Kossuth, for example, the Hungarian patriot, came here and raised money, and he was celebrated everywhere. We were enthusiastic supporters of that rebellion. I mean, the Austrian-Hungarian minister complained to Daniel Webster, who was Secretary of State. He said, Mr. Secretary, your country is supporting these revolutions abroad. Now, normal diplomatic situation, the Secretary of State would probably gobble it up and kind of play that down. But Webster's reply is extraordinary. Yes, we are the source of all those rebellions that are occurring in Europe. We are the responsible for it. And he goes on in this tirade, attacking the Austrian-Hungarian minister, saying, taking full responsibility, which of course we weren't, but that's how we thought about revolutions that were Republican in a world of monarchies. And then he ends the message by saying, besides, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire has been a speck on the Earth's surface compared to the great United States. I mean, that's now they all fail. So Lincoln is, when he says, this is it, we're the last best hope. Right. If we fail, then the dream fails. Right. The democracy fails. And we might never have it again. Because if this nation falls apart, this dream that has just been destroyed in Europe will never be revived. Because it'll look like democracy doesn't work. And I think it's in that context you have to understand the Gettysburg Address and his rhetoric. He really believed that, and it was true. I mean, this is the only major democracy left. And all these rebellions, which seemed so full of hope, had all been dissipated, all failed. I mean, in France, you have Napoleon III. He looked so promising at the outset, and he ends up being the second emperor, second Napoleon. It seemed like monarchy was here forever. So I think that's the context for understanding Lincoln. And he's sincere when he says, so he's going to, this United States is important in his mind, not just for his fellow Americans, but for the history of the world. Right. And he gives you that worldwide context because he had the same vision that Jefferson did, that the whole world's going to eventually follow our leadership and become democratic. And he says that if we fail, then the dream is gone. That's, I think, is the way to understand Lincoln. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
When you were making your point about the different ideals regarding labor, I was wondering how you fit the Jacksonian democracy into that. So is he the champion of the common man who wants equal opportunity for all, or is he the person protecting slavery and protecting one's rights to own slaves? Like, do they exist together in him, or is he just an enigma?
I mean, Jackson just took his slaveholding for granted. I don't think that's what his administration was about. He's a very Trump-like figure, and probably the president closest to, in the past, who had the same kind of reputation, to some extent, that Trump has, hated by northern elites. I mean, John Quincy Adams refused to go to his inauguration, and was appalled that his dear Harvard would give Jackson an honorary degree because he was a vulgar man without education. But Jackson stood for common people, and he voiced this democratic rhetoric, and he was a union man. I mean, he stood up, but he was a slaveholder too, but I don't think that's what he was about, and I don't think that's what he thought he was about. He was defending against threats from the South, Calhoun, and breaking up the Union, and he was defending the common man. His rhetoric transcends. He has scarcely understood he's not a learned man. He scarcely understood the nature of his following, but he does represent democracy. That was a moment when authority of all sorts was being questioned in America. In that respect, it's very similar to the present. epistemological doubts. What's true? You know, this is the era of P.T. Barnum. How did Barnum worked on this. He was a genius because he would say, look, I've got this woman who's a mermaid. She has a fish tail. It's in my museum. But he would plant a story in the newspapers. Who could believe that? I mean, how can that be true? And of course, people would flock to go because they said, well, I can only trust my own eyes. I don't believe what elites tell me. They would say, well, the moon has green cheese on it. And the elites would say, well, of course the moon doesn't have green cheese. That's not made of green cheese. But Barnum would raise the question, well, how do they know? How can you know anything? You only know what you see and feel. And of course, that, as Herman Melville said, that's what common people think, that they have to trust their own eyes and ears and senses. But learned people have reason, and they can transcend their senses. That was a crisis in that period. That's why you had all the hoaxes. I mean, they flourished, more so than we have to. We have the same kind of problem because we have this internet with social media. So any old crank can get himself, get himself heard. But the same thing was happening in the 1820s and 30s with people questioning elites and authority of all sorts. How can you trust them? How could they? And we have the same mistrust of elites now. And therefore, all kinds of rumors spread. Vaccinations are dangerous. I mean, all kinds of things spread because nobody trusts authority anymore. And that's a real crisis. And that was the only period in our history that's comparable, in my mind, is the Jacksonian period, where you had an epistemological crisis. And that's why Edgar Allan Poe would have hoaxes, and Barnum really cannot be explained. The success of Barnum, he's a genius because he understands the public he's dealing with, and he really exploited that mistrust of authority. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your comments today. I've got one quick question for you, and that is when you began to talk about differences in culture, the North and the South, would you like to comment in regards to the religious background behind each of the developing systems, the Calvinist and the Church of England, that seem to be very strong in both of those areas, Calvinist North and Church of England South?
Well, of course, there were Baptists in the North and Baptists in the South, and they were, until they came to the eve of the Civil War, they were Baptists, but then they broke. The Southern Baptists separated from the Northern Baptists. The Episcopal Church, of course, was conservative, and it didn't follow. I mean, they didn't have, as far as I know, didn't have a Northern, but it was a minor minor church in the North and minor in terms of numbers in the South. But so the religions broke, but there was no religion that was confined, as far as I know, to the South and to the North that was distinctive. There were Baptists, and there were Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists. They went off in different directions. But that comes late. In the 1840s and 50s, they begin to break apart. But I'm not sure the gist of your question, but that...
Calvinism. Calvinist Puritan work ethic.
Oh, now it's a little misleading because the Puritan work ethic is often associated with capitalism. Max Weber made a lot of that. The Puritans certainly did emphasize that because they wanted to keep... They didn't sort of celebrate work as a source of productivity in the society, but celebrated it as a way of keeping the lower orders busy so they won't get into trouble. But the interesting question is, where does this celebration of work come from? And it's the United States celebrates work in the antebellum period to an extent not duplicated elsewhere in the world. If you read Tocqueville, one of the things that when he comes here in 1830s is the extent to which people are celebrating work, even the manual labor. He says, and the making of money, which elsewhere among aristocrats or elites is held in contempt. Now, Tocqueville says, well, look, Frenchmen like money too, but they don't ever say that they like it. They always hide that fact. And he's really surprised. He said, gee, he said, you went into Albany. He had the whole list of officers from the mayor, council, and so on, and they all list their salaries they're going to get. He says, this is unprecedented. He's overwhelmed by the celebration of labor, the work. And people want to know, one of the big sociological questions, how come we never had a labor party develop? Well, people in the North, work was so celebrated that even the professionals, like Edward Everett, has to say, talking to work, he wants to run for office, he say, look, I'm a worker too. I have a law office and I work just as hard as you do. He has to celebrate what he does as labor. And somehow, if the whole society is laboring, then where's the Labor Party? It's only because in England you had a proletariat, or the work and the aristocracy were separated, and the celebration of leisure is an aristocratic element. You've seen Downton Abbey. You remember Maggie Smith? This is into the 20th century, and she's still living in the 19th century, and she doesn't understand why her new grandson-in-law, who's inherited the estate, wants to keep his job. Right. He can't do that. He has to run the estate. That's what aristocrats do. They don't work. You know, that's emphasized. The scriptwriter was very insightful, and he knew his history. And he has her saying, you know, what's a weekend? She doesn't understand. Aristocrats do not labor. They don't work for money. Their income comes without exertion from all the rents that are coming. Now, this goes back to the Constitution. One of the reasons why we don't have a lot of tenantry, unlike England. But how did our aristocrats live? Well, they lived by lending money out and living off the interest from the loans. They had money, but they didn't have land. They couldn't act as landlords because there's too much land available, so people aren't going to put up with being tenants. So what these elites are doing, and this is northern elites as well, are lending money out and getting the interest back. The reason they're so upset, and Madison in particular is upset with paper money, all of them are upset with paper money, is because paper money is inflating the currency, and these debtors are paying back to their creditors, that is the elite, a fraction. They're paying back in paper what was lent out in gold and silver. And they are really upset by that because it's destroying not just a problem of money, it's destroying their capacity to be leaders, to be aristocrats. And that's one of the factors that lies behind the obsession with paper money that goes into the convention. Madison wanted a veto given over all state legislation. And one of the things he wanted to get rid of were all these unjust laws, particularly the issuing of paper money. Well, he doesn't get his veto because it's so impractical. Can you imagine every state would have to send in its laws to the Congress before they got approved? And wiser heads prevail, and they have Article 1, Section 10 in the Constitution prohibits the states from doing certain things. They can't pass tariffs. They cannot print money. That's probably a good thing today. But the antebellum, as I say, the antebellum North would never have succeeded as well as it did, except by getting around this prohibition and creating banks, chartering banks, which then issued the paper money. So you had millions of dollars of paper money flying around. It was incredibly complicated for businessmen, but nonetheless, they succeeded. It must have been an awful thing. You get a note from, you're in Virginia here, or Northern Virginia, Washington, you get a note from, Albany, $100. The bank in Albany will pay you $100 in gold and silver. But you don't want to go to Albany to get it, so you might discount it. But that's the kind of business you had to deal with. They had books. Merchants had books where they would open up and say, ooh, Albany, that's not a good reputation. I'm going to discount this bill or I won't take it. I mean, that's the way it operated. It was a very difficult business for retail men to operate. But the planters in the South don't have that problem because they're dealing with England, and they're no English merchant is going to accept any paper, he's got to have gold and silver or else a bill of credit. He's got to have something more substantial than a... But for internal trade between, say, York, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, paper money was perfect, and it really fed the economy. Anyway, that's getting beyond the...
Let's do one more question.
Okay.
And we'll have a little reception afterwards. Back here.
Again, I want to express my thanks to you for coming. I kind of wanted to riff off of the idea of the epistemological crisis, and was wondering your theory or theories on the source of that crisis.
Now, what crisis is this? The Civil War crisis?
The epistemological crisis.
Epistemological. Well, how do you know anything? You know, epistemology is the theories of knowledge, and the epistemological crisis, how do you trust what you know? I mean, if some physician, somebody you trust says vaccinations are good, but if you come to doubt this authority and you don't believe it, then you got a kind of epistemological crisis. You're not sure what's true, what's not true. How do you test things? That's what was happening in the 1830s, and it's happening to us today. Not to the same extent. I mean, we still have a lot of authorities that we respect. Most people do. But there are pockets, and you know the internet just is flooded with this stuff. And it creates doubts everywhere. So many ordinary people are really mistrustful of the world that most of us accept. But you can't trust the politicians, you can't trust people in authority. It's very, very difficult. You know, this is a world where you lose trust. You can't verify everything. You have to trust somebody. I mean, someone tells you that, I don't know, Mount Everest is 29,000 feet. You can't go and count and go up there and measure it. You take their word for it. Well, there are a whole host of things where we take people's word. But if we come to doubt their words, then you have a real crisis. We have a crisis of authority in the country. And it's not just politicians, but everybody. Physicians and bankers and corporate leaders. And you get politicians attacking your leaders and essentially saying they're a bunch of liars, then your mistrust grows. People are playing with fire. It's a tricky issue. But the 1830s were far worse. And of course, they didn't have, they had their own media, newspapers, but they didn't have anything comparable to the social media. No one crackpot could have his voice heard usually. But that's what I meant by an epistemological crisis. How you know anything? How do you know what's true or not true? Yes, is this a follow-up to this? I can't hear you.
I heard him ask not so much what was it, as to why it happened. And it sounds like, is it fair to say that the epistemological crisis of the 1830s happened as a consequence of the radicalism of the American Revolution?
Yes. I mean, it's the spread of the anti-elite arguments were so forceful. Elites were on their heels in that period. They simply never, it's a rising up of ordinary people, celebration of common people, celebration of labor to an extent unprecedented in the history of the Western world, which is essentially the world. And so people really, they didn't trust elites were having a very hard time justifying themselves. And to some extent, that's one of the problems we have today with us. So in that sense, Trump is, some columnists are calling Trump's followers the Jacksonians. And that's not a bad, that's pretty appropriate because I think it's similar. He's obviously a genius with social media. He's tapped into something that's kind of, people are going to write about that, the way they write about P.T. Barnum. he's got some kind of access to the culture that's puzzling to many of us. I mean, it's just incredible what's happening. But I think the Jacksonian period is a good comparable period. Okay.
Let's start appreciating.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Thanks.